Greta Schneider always knew she wasn't cut out for German city life. At 42, after 15 years working as a bank manager in Düsseldorf, she woke up every morning feeling suffocated by the grey concrete, the incessant traffic, and the mechanical routine that had consumed her adult life. Her painful divorce from Klaus 2 years earlier only intensified her feeling that she needed a radical change. "You need a vacation, not a new life," her sister Emma had said during one of their late-night phone conversations. "Düsseldorf isn't that bad. You have a good job, a nice apartment." "An empty apartment where I feel like a ghost," Greta interrupted. "Emma, I look out the window and see only buildings. There's no horizon, no open sky. I feel like I'm slowly dying in here." It was this feeling of existential claustrophobia that led Greta to sign up for international dating apps. She wasn't just looking for a man. She was looking for a different life, a possibility of escape that she couldn't imagine within Germany's borders. Carlos Mendoza's profile appeared on her screen one rainy March afternoon, like a window to another world. The photos showed a strong, dark-skinned 38-year-old man smiling under an endless blue sky, with green fields stretching to the horizon behind him. The description read, "Farmer and meat exporter, 10,000 hectares in San Luis, Argentina, seeking partner to share a simple, authentic life away from urban chaos." Greta stared at those images for almost an hour. The contrast between Carlos's life and her own was so dramatic that it seemed almost fictional. While she spent her days in an office tower, analyzing numbers on spreadsheets, he lived under the open sky, raising cattle, working with his own hands. Carlos's first message arrived 2 days later. "Greta, I saw your profile and was intrigued. A German woman who dreams of rural life. That's rare these days. Would you really give up everything to live simply, or is it just an urban fantasy?" The direct question surprised her. There were no obvious gallantries or empty compliments, just an honest question that went straight to the heart of her inner conflicts. "I don't know if I would have the courage," she replied. "But the fantasy seems more real than my current life." The conversations that followed over the next few weeks were unlike anything Greta had experienced in previous relationships. Carlos didn't talk about fancy restaurants or trips to exotic destinations. Instead, he described the sunrise over the pampas, the sound of the wind through the wheat fields, the satisfaction of seeing hundreds of cattle grazing on land that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. "Here, you know each season not by the calendar, but by the signs the earth gives you," he wrote in a particularly poetic message. "In the fall, the air gets drier and the cattle seek out the most sheltered areas. In the winter, you can see your own breath when you leave the house at dawn. In the spring, everything is reborn, not just the plants, but your soul as well." Greta read these messages during her lunch break, sitting at her sterile desk on the 22nd floor of an office building, and felt a deep longing for a life she had never lived. Klaus had never spoken to her like this before. He had never described a world where she could feel truly alive. After 2 months of daily conversations, Carlos made the proposal that would change everything. "Greta, I want you to come and see my life here. Not as a tourist, but to really experience what it would be like to live in the pampas. Stay for a month, work with me on the farm, feel the earth beneath your feet. If it's not for you, I'll pay for your ticket back. But if it is, well, then we'll talk about a future together." The offer was tempting and terrifying at the same time. Greta had accumulated 5 weeks of vacation time that she had never used, always making excuses not to travel alone. But Argentina, a real farm, the chance to find out if her rural dreams were viable or just romantic escapism. "I need time to think," she replied, but she already knew what her answer would be. That night, Greta stayed up until 3 in the morning researching San Luis, Argentina. The images she found online seemed to confirm everything Carlos had described. Vast plains, immense skies, a landscape that promised freedom in a way Dusseldorf could never offer. By morning, she had made her decision. She requested time off work, bought tickets to Buenos Aires, and prepared for the adventure that could define the rest of her life. "You've completely lost your mind," Emma said when Greta told her about her plans. "You're going to travel to another continent to meet a man you've only seen in photos. What if he's a psychopath? What if he's married? What if he's not even a farmer?" They were all valid concerns, but Greta felt something she hadn't felt in years: genuine hope. "Emma, if I don't do this now, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering, what if? I'd rather take the risk and find out the truth than die of curiosity in Dusseldorf." 2 weeks later, Greta was at Dusseldorf airport, looking at the grey city through the terminal windows for the last time. In the next 14 hours, she would be on the other side of the world, on an Argentine farm, beginning what she hoped would be the first chapter of a completely new life. She had no way of knowing that she was flying straight into a nightmare that would test every fiber of her endurance and courage. The flight from Dusseldorf to Buenos Aires seemed to last forever, but when Greta finally landed at Ezeiza International Airport, she felt a rush of adrenaline she hadn't experienced in years. The Argentine air smelled different, less industrial, more organic, as if it carried the promise of a more authentic life. Carlos was waiting for her in the international arrivals area, holding a sign with her name written in large, legible letters. When she saw him in person for the first time, she felt immense relief. He was exactly as he appeared in the photos: tall, dark, with calloused hands that indicated real physical labor and a genuine smile that lit up his entire face when he saw her. "Greta! Finally!" He enveloped her in a warm embrace that smelled of leather and open fields. "How was the flight? You must be exhausted. We have a 4-hour drive to the farm, but I promise it's worth it." During the drive to San Luis, traveling on roads that gradually changed from urban asphalt to rural dirt, Carlos was the perfect tour guide. He explained Argentine geography, told stories about the region, pointed out landmarks, and always included personal details that made Greta feel like part of the narrative. "That mountain over there," he said, pointing to a distant elevation, "is where my grandfather used to take the cattle in the summer. He taught me how to ride a horse in these fields. My family has been on this land for almost 100 years. We are true Argentine gauchos." As they drove away from Buenos Aires, the landscape opened up impressively. Fields stretching beyond the horizon, a blue sky without a single cloud, and a silence that contrasted dramatically with the constant noise of Dusseldorf. Greta felt as if she were entering a movie where she would finally be the protagonist of her own life. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined," she said with the window open, letting the Argentine wind mess up her hair. "How can you work with all this beauty around you without getting distracted?" Carlos laughed. "You get used to it, but you never lose the magic. Wait until you see the sunrise tomorrow. There's nothing like it in the world." When they finally arrived at the ranch, Greta felt she had found the place where she belonged. The property was exactly as Carlos had described: a main house built in the Argentine colonial style, with wide verandas and dark wooden beams, well-kept stables where magnificent horses grazed peacefully, and fields that stretched endlessly in all directions. "This is your home for the next few days," Carlos said, showing her a charming guest room with windows overlooking the pampas. "Early tomorrow, I'll show you how the farm routine works. I hope you brought appropriate clothing for rural work." Dinner that first night was magical. Carlos personally cooked a traditional Argentine roast, accompanied by local red wine that he produced himself on a small scale. They ate on the porch, under a starry sky that Greta had never seen before. Without light pollution, the stars looked like jewels scattered on black velvet. "In Dusseldorf, I can hardly see the stars," she said, in awe. "Here, It's as if the entire universe is visible. One of the advantages of living far from civilization, Carlos replied, refilling her glass. Here, you remember that you are part of something much bigger. During the first 2 weeks, life on the farm was everything Greta had dreamed of and more. Carlos taught her how to ride a horse. She had taken lessons in Germany as a child, but riding across the Argentine pampas was a completely different experience. They rode through the fields together in the morning, checking on the cattle, repairing fences, and Carlos explained every aspect of the cattle business. "This is Esperanza," he said, introducing her to a brown mare with white spots. "She'll be your companion while you're here. She's gentle, but she has personality." Greta learned to milk cows, separate calves, and identify signs of disease in cattle. Her hands, which for 15 years had only touched computer keyboards and bank papers, were now calloused and covered in dirt, and she loved every minute of it. "You're a natural," Carlos said, watching her work with an orphaned calf she had taken it upon herself to bottle feed. Most city women would have given up on the first day. The evenings were just as perfect. After work, they cooked together, drank wine on the porch, and Carlos told stories about 3 generations of Mendozas who had worked that land. Greta felt connected not only to Carlos, but to a whole lineage of people who had lived simply and authentically. It was during the 3rd week that Carlos made the proposal that would change everything. "Greta, I know you planned to stay only a month, but what if you stayed forever? What if you sold everything in Germany and came to live with me here?" Greta's heart leapt. It was exactly what she had secretly hoped to hear, but the reality of the decision terrified her. "Carlos, it's a huge step. My whole life is in Germany. A life that you yourself said was slowly killing you," he reminded her, taking her hands. "Here you are alive, Greta. I see it in your eyes every day. You flourish in this land like a plant that has finally found the right soil." They spent hours that night discussing the future. Carlos explained that the farm was thriving. They exported meat to several countries, including Germany, and there were plans to expand operations. With the money from the sale of Greta's apartment in Düsseldorf, they could modernize equipment and significantly increase production. "It would be a partnership in every sense," he said. "Business partners and life partners. We would build something together that would last for generations." The next morning, Carlos showed her the farm's accounting books. The numbers were impressive. The operation generated more than $500,000 annually in net profit, an amount that made Greta realize that Carlos was not just a romantic farmer, but a successful rural entrepreneur. With an investment of $120,000 for modernization, he explained, showing her plans for new stables and equipment. "We could double our production in 2 years. Your contribution would be crucial to this expansion." Greta knew she had exactly $145,000 in savings, the result of years of frugal living and the sale of some investments after her divorce. The idea of investing $120,000 in something so far removed from her experience made her nervous, but Carlos was keen to point out that this was not a personal favor, but a legitimate investment with a guaranteed return. "You're not giving me money, Greta. You're investing in our future together. This farm will be as much yours as it is mine." On the penultimate night of her planned stay, Greta made the decision that would change her life forever. Sitting on the porch, looking up at the Argentine stars that now felt like her stars, she said the words that would seal her fate. "Yes, Carlos, I want to stay. I want to build a life here with you." The smile that spread across Carlos's face was radiant, and the kiss that followed promised a future of happiness and adventure that Greta had never imagined possible. She didn't know that she was about to discover a completely different side to the man she had grown to love. Greta's return to Germany was tumultuous and filled with conflicting emotions. She had only 2 weeks to organize her entire life and sell her possessions before returning permanently to Argentina. The decision had been made, but executing it proved more complicated than she had anticipated. "You've completely lost your mind," Emma repeated for the 10th time as she helped Greta pack her belongings. "You've known this man for a month, and you're moving to another continent. You're going to invest your life savings in a farm in the middle of nowhere?" "It's not in the middle of nowhere," Greta replied, carefully wrapping the photo of her parents. "It's a legitimate and profitable business. Carlos showed me all the documents, all the numbers, and Emma, I've never felt more alive than I have this past month." The process of selling the apartment was faster than she had expected. The real estate market in Dusseldorf was hot, and her well-located property attracted multiple buyers. Within 10 days, she had closed the sale for $140,000, slightly above the appraised value. Quitting her job at the bank was both terrifying and liberating. Her boss, Herr Müller, tried to dissuade her from her decision. "Miss Schneider, you are throwing away a 15-year career for a romantic fantasy. What if it doesn't work out? How are you going to rebuild your professional life at 42? "Then I'll rebuild it," Greta replied with more confidence than she actually felt. "But if I don't try, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering, what if?" During those 2 weeks, Carlos kept in daily contact via WhatsApp and video calls. He shared updates about the farm, sent photos of the animals, especially the mare Esperanza, who he joked was missing her new German mom, and discussed detailed plans for the modernization they would undertake together. "I've already started talking to equipment suppliers," he said during an evening video call. "With your investment, we can start construction as soon as you return. In 6 months, we'll have the most modern operation in the region." Greta felt important and valued in a way she had never experienced in her years at the bank. There, she was just one manager among dozens. Here, she would be an integral partner in a venture that would grow through her direct contribution. The flight back to Buenos Aires in May was completely different from the first trip. This time, Greta wasn't visiting. She was going home. She had sold or donated almost all of her belongings, keeping only 2 suitcases of clothes suitable for rural life and a few personal items of sentimental value. Carlos greeted her at the airport with the same enthusiasm as the first time, but now there was a possessive quality to his embrace that she interpreted as deep love. "Welcome home, my partner," he whispered in her ear. "Our real life begins now." The transition to permanent life on the farm was easier than Greta had anticipated. Carlos had set up an office for her in the main house, where she could manage the financial aspects of the operation while he took care of the physical work. It was a division of labor that made sense and utilized the skills she had developed in the banking sector. "You understand numbers better than I do," Carlos explained, showing her stacks of financial documents. "I know how to raise cattle, but you know how to make money grow." In the first few months, Greta felt truly fulfilled. She modernized the farm's accounting systems, implemented management software that allowed each head of cattle to be tracked individually, and renegotiated contracts with buyers that resulted in 15% price increases. "You're a genius," Carlos said, when she showed him the improved third-quarter figures. "In just 3 months, you've already paid for yourself." The $120,000 investment was transferred gradually over the first few months. Carlos explained that it was better to make equipment purchases and improvements in stages to ensure better quality control and avoid problems with local suppliers. "In Argentina, business works differently than in Germany," he explained. "Here, personal relationships are more important than contracts. I need to visit each supplier in person, have a coffee, get to know their families. It takes longer, but it results in better partnerships." It was during the 4th month that Greta began to notice some small but disturbing inconsistencies. During a routine check of the accounting books, she discovered several transactions that she couldn't clearly categorize. "Carlos, there's $15,000 in expenses marked only as special operations. Can you explain what those are?" Carlos looked momentarily uncomfortable before smiling. "Oh, those are payments to local authorities. In Argentina, we sometimes need to, how do you Germans say it, oil the wheels to keep operations running smoothly." Greta frowned. "Are you talking about bribes?" "Not bribes," Carlos said quickly. "They're administrative fees, Christmas gifts for veterinary inspectors, small payments to speed up licenses. It's normal here, part of the cost of doing business." The explanation made her uncomfortable, but she decided to trust Carlos. After all, he knew the Argentine system much better than she did, and the farm was clearly thriving. It was also during this period that Greta met Sofia, a 19-year-old girl whom Carlos introduced as his niece. Sofia was beautiful, but there was something in her eyes that resembled a frightened animal. She spoke little, always kept her head down when Carlos was present, and seemed terrified whenever he addressed her. "Sofia is going through a difficult time," Carlos explained when Greta asked about the young woman's strange behavior. "Family problems. I'm letting her stay here until things work themselves out. It's important to help family, you understand." Sofia stayed in a small separate house on the property, and Carlos was very clear about one specific rule. It's best not to bother Sofia too much. She needs space to process her issues. Women can be complicated when they're dealing with family trauma. Greta respected the request, but she couldn't stop observing Sofia from a distance. There was something about the dynamic between Carlos and the young woman that bothered her deeply, although she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. As the Argentine winter approached, Greta felt settled into her new life. She had modernized the operation, increased profits, and built a solid partnership with Carlos. But small doubts began to accumulate in her mind, like clouds forming on the horizon of her rural happiness. She did not yet know that these clouds were harbingers of a storm that would completely destroy her worldview. The Argentine winter brought a subtle but noticeable change in the dynamics of the farm. Carlos, who during the first few months had been attentive and affectionate, began to show aspects of his personality that Greta had not seen before. The changes were small at first: a harsher tone when they discussed business, impatience when she asked questions about unexplained expenses, and a growing tendency to make unilateral decisions without consulting her. "Greta, you need to understand that I'm the boss here," he said during a discussion about buying new horses. "In Argentina, farms operate as hierarchies. You can make suggestions, but the final decisions are mine." The statement surprised her. Throughout the entire process of cutting and investing, Carlos had emphasized that they would be equal partners. Now, he was establishing a power dynamic that reduced her to an advisory role rather than a managerial one. "Carlos, I invested $120,000 in this operation. Doesn't that give me the right to participate in important decisions?" "Of course it does," he replied, but his tone was unconvincing. "But you need to trust my local expertise. I know this country, these suppliers, this culture. You're smart with numbers, but for strategic decisions, you need to trust me." It was on a particularly cold July morning that Greta made a discovery that deeply disturbed her. She was organizing documents in the office when she found a folder that Carlos had left open on his desk. Inside were contracts in Spanish that she couldn't fully understand, but she was able to identify amounts and dates. According to the documents, the farm had sold $200,000 worth of cattle during the previous month, a sale Carlos had never mentioned to her. When she checked the accounting books she kept herself, there was no record of this transaction. That evening, during dinner, she confronted Carlos about the discrepancy. "Carlos, I found contracts for a $200,000 cattle sale that doesn't appear in our records. Can you explain this? Carlos's reaction was immediate and intense. His face darkened, and for the first time since she had known him, Greta saw something that looked genuinely dangerous in his eyes. Were you going through my private papers? I wasn't going through them. The folder was open on your desk. I was just organizing. Greta, there are aspects of this business that are complicated to explain to someone who doesn't understand how things work in Argentina. His voice had a veiled, threatening tone she had never heard before. Some transactions need to be discreet for tax reasons. Discreet? Carlos? We're talking about $200,000. Is that tax evasion? Carlos stood up abruptly from the table, his chair scraping violently against the wooden floor. Are you accusing me of something, Greta? After everything I've done for you? I brought you into my home, made you my partner, gave you a life you could never have in your dreary Germany. I don't owe you anything, Carlos. I invested my money in this farm. I work here every day. I have a right to know what's going on. The silence that followed was tense and heavy. Carlos studied her for a long moment, as if evaluating something. Finally, he spoke, but his voice was cold. Maybe you should consider whether you really want to be my partner, Greta. Partnership requires trust. If you can't trust me, maybe you made a mistake coming here. The implied threat was clear. Trust me blindly or leave. But leaving was not a simple option. Greta had invested all her savings and sold everything in Germany. She was financially dependent on the farm's success, and Carlos knew it. In the days that followed, the tension between them was palpable. Carlos became cold and distant, speaking to her only when necessary for operational matters. He also began to exclude her from meetings with suppliers and buyers, saying that business in Spanish is too complex for non-natives. It was during this period of ostracism that Greta began to pay more attention to Sofia. The young woman seemed even more frightened in recent weeks, and Greta noticed that she had lost visible weight. Whenever Carlos was not present, Sofia worked in the kitchen or cleaned the house, but the moment he appeared, she disappeared like a shadow. One afternoon, when Carlos had gone out to town, Greta decided to try to talk to Sofia directly. She found her in the laundry room, washing clothes by hand, even though there was a perfectly functional washing machine in the main house. Sofia, is everything okay? You seem worried lately. The young woman looked around nervously before responding in hesitant Spanish mixed with Portuguese. Señora Greta, yo... I can't talk. El patron, Carlos. He doesn't like it when I talk to you. Why wouldn't he? We're all women here. We need to support each other. Sofia began to cry silently, her tears falling onto the wet clothes. Señora, you need to be careful. Carlos, he's not a good man. Before Greta could ask any more questions, she heard the sound of Carlos's car pulling up. Sofia immediately dried her tears and went back to work, her posture stiffening with fear. Was Sofia bothering you? Carlos asked, when he entered the laundry room a few minutes later. No, we were just talking a little. You'd better not spend too much time with Sofia, he said, his voice carrying a clear warning. She has mental problems. Sometimes she makes up stories, says things that aren't true. That's why I can't send her away. She would have nowhere to go, but I also can't trust what she says. That night, Greta couldn't sleep. Sofia's words echoed in her mind. Carlos is not a good man. Combined with the hidden financial transactions, the increasingly controlling behavior, and the atmosphere of fear that seemed to permeate the property, she began to seriously question whether she had made the biggest mistake of her life. But she was trapped. No money to return to Germany, no home to return to, no job waiting for her. Carlos had created a situation where she was completely dependent on him for survival. and she was beginning to suspect that this was no coincidence. As she looked out the bedroom window at the Argentine fields that once represented freedom, Greta felt for the first time that she had traded an urban prison for a rural one. The difference was that this prison had infinite horizons, but the walls were much harder to climb. The next day, while Carlos was busy with the animals, Greta decided to investigate further. She knew there were important documents in Carlos's private office in the main house, a room he always kept locked. But she had noticed that he often forgot to lock it during the day, especially when he was working in the distant fields. Her opportunity came when Carlos took several workers to repair fences in the northern part of the farm, a job that would take at least 3 hours. With her heart pounding, Greta quietly entered the forbidden office. What she found there completely changed her understanding of the situation. There were folders organized by year, containing documents that told a very different story from the one Carlos had shared with her. The farm had not been owned by the Mendoza family for 3 generations. Carlos had purchased the property only 2 years earlier with money of questionable origin. Even more disturbing were the documents that showed the true extent of Carlos's discreet operations. There were records of cattle sales that had never made it into the official books, totaling more than $800,000 over the past 18 months. There was also correspondence with buyers in countries she knew to have dubious reputations for money laundering. But what really terrified her was a folder marked "Personal Staff" that contained documents about Sofia and 4 other women. The documents included photos, personal information, and what appeared to be contracts written in complex legal Spanish. Even without fully understanding the language, Greta was able to identify terms related to domestic services, mandatory residence, and terms of 5 años. Sofia was not Carlos's niece with family problems. She was a maid hired under terms that seemed suspiciously close to debt bondage. And according to the documents, there were 4 other women in similar situations on other properties that Carlos apparently controlled. The sound of an approaching car prompted Greta to quickly photograph the most important documents with her cell phone before rushing out of the office. She barely had time to compose herself before Carlos entered the house, sweaty and covered in dirt. "How was your morning, my love?" he asked. But his eyes were alert, as if he were looking for signs that something was out of place. "Quiet. I organized some numbers from last week." Greta forced a smile, hoping her voice wouldn't betray the panic she felt. That night she stayed up late, studying the photos she had taken of the documents. Slowly, a terrifying picture began to form. Carlos wasn't just a farmer involved in tax evasion. He was at the center of an operation that seemed to involve human trafficking, money laundering, and possibly even worse things. And she was stuck in the middle of it all, 12,000 kilometers from home, with no money, no resources, and now no illusions about the man she had learned to fear. The following week passed in a fog of controlled terror. Greta knew she had uncovered something monstrous, but she also knew that reacting rashly could put her in mortal danger. Carlos was clearly more dangerous than she had imagined, and she was isolated on a remote farm, far from any potential help. Her opportunity to learn more came when Carlos announced that he needed to travel to Buenos Aires for 3 days to take care of banking matters. It was the first time since her discovery in the office that he would leave her alone on the farm for an extended period. "Make sure Sofia keeps the house clean while I'm away," he instructed before leaving. "And Greta, don't let her fill your head with her fantasies. Sometimes she makes up dramatic stories to get attention." As soon as Carlos's car disappeared down the dirt road, Greta went to look for Sofia. She found her in the kitchen, preparing a simple lunch, but when she saw Greta approaching, the young woman immediately became tense. "Sofia, Carlos is away for a few days. Can we talk honestly now?" Greta spoke slowly, using the little Spanish she had learned. "I know something is wrong here. Please tell me the truth." Sophia looked around nervously, as if Carlos might appear at any moment, before beginning to cry silently. "Senora Greta, I can't. If he finds out I've spoken..." "He won't find out, I promise, but I need to understand what's going on. You're not really his niece, are you?" The question opened the floodgates. Sophia collapsed into a chair and began to tell a story that made Greta feel physically nauseous. Sophia had been recruited from a poor village in northern Argentina with promises of well-paid domestic work. Instead, she had been brought to the farm and forced to sign contracts that bound her for 5 years. "He says I owe him money for food, for room, for transportation. Every week the debt gets bigger. Él dice que si yo intento irme, la policía me arrestará por robo." Sophia showed marks on her wrists where she had been tied up. "Y cuando yo no hago lo que él quiere, él me castiga." Greta felt bile rising in her throat. "Sophia, are there other women like you?" "Sí, señora. There are 3 other farms. Elena is on the farm near Córdoba. Maria and Carmen are near Mendoza. All of us. We are all trapped like this." "Why haven't you gone to the police?" Sophia laughed bitterly. "Carlos pays off the local police. Besides, he threatens our families if we try to escape. My mother, my little brother, he knows where they live." Over the next few hours, Sophia revealed the full extent of Carlos's operation. He used the farms not only to launder money through fake cattle sales, but also as detention centers for young women he kept as forced laborers. Some were used for domestic work, others for purposes Sophia did not want to detail, but which Greta was able to infer with growing horror. "What about the German women, Senora? You're not the first." Greta felt her blood run cold. "I'm not the first German woman. No? 2 years ago it was Ingrid, an older woman like you. He said she was an investor like you. But after a few months..." Sophia shook her head sadly. "What happened to Ingrid?" "She started asking questions like you. She found papers like you. One day Carlos said she had an accident with a horse, very sad, but..." Sophia lowered her voice to a whisper. "I saw it. It wasn't an accident." Greta's world seemed to tilt. There was another German woman who had fallen into the same trap, and now she was apparently dead. "Sophia, where is Ingrid now?" Sophia pointed in a direction in the distant mountains. "There's a place there, a place where Carlos buries things he doesn't want people to find." Greta realized she was looking at her own future. Carlos had used the same method with Ingrid: romance, promises of partnership, isolation, and then elimination when she became a problem. And from the documents she had found, she knew that there had been previous European investors who had contributed to Carlos's operations. "Sophia, I'm going to get you out of here, all of you. But first I need to contact the German authorities." "No, Senora, it's too dangerous. Carlos has friends everywhere. Police, government, banks. If you try..." Sophia touched her own neck meaningfully, but Greta had already made her decision. She would no longer be a silent victim. She had evidence, she had witnesses, and she had access to the outside world that the other women did not. It was her responsibility not only to escape, but to ensure that Carlos could never do this to other women again. That night, using Carlos's computer, Greta wrote a detailed message to the German consulate in Buenos Aires, attaching all the photos of the documents she had taken. She also sent copies to her sister Emma, with instructions that if anything happened to her, Emma should immediately contact Interpol. "If you are reading this," she wrote to Emma, "it means I have discovered something terrible about Carlos and may be in danger. He is not who he appears to be. There are other women here being held against their will, and I suspect there were German women before me who never returned home." She programmed the messages to be sent automatically if she did not log into the system within 48 hours, a precaution she hoped she would never need to use. When Carlos returned from Buenos Aires in 2 days, she would be ready to confront him. But this time, she would not be alone and unprotected. This time, she had a plan. What she didn't know was that Carlos had returned a day earlier than planned, and that he had been watching the farm through remote security cameras she had never discovered. He knew exactly what she had found, exactly who she had talked to, and exactly what messages she had sent, and he was coming home with plans to solve the Greta problem permanently. Greta woke up in the early hours of the 3rd day to the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up. Carlos had returned a day earlier than expected, and something about the sound of the engine, aggressive, urgent, immediately alerted her that something was wrong. She looked out the window and saw not only Carlos's car, but also a second vehicle with 2 men she had never seen before. Her heart raced. The automatic messages she had programmed had not yet been sent. There were still a few hours left before the 48-hour deadline. If something happened to her now, no one would know where to look until it was too late. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching the main house made her act on instinct. She quickly put on dark clothes, grabbed her passport and the little money she had hidden, and hid in the bedroom closet, leaving the door ajar so she could hear what was going on. "Where is she?" Carlos's voice was cold and controlled, but Greta could detect a dangerous fury underneath. "Probably still asleep, Jefe," replied a male voice she didn't recognize. "Do you want us to wake her up?" "Not yet. First, let's check what she really found out. Ramirez, go check my office. Look for signs that someone has tampered with the documents. Joaquin, you come with me to Sophia's house. I need to make sure that bitch hasn't said anything to the German woman." Greta felt pure panic. They were going to interrogate Sophia, and she knew the young woman wouldn't hold up under pressure. Worse still, Carlos clearly suspected she had discovered his secrets. She needed to get off the farm immediately. As she listened to the men disperse, Greta slipped silently out the back window of the bedroom. The main house was about 200 yards from the small dwelling where Sophia stayed, and she could see lights coming on there through the pre-dawn darkness. She began to move toward the stables, where she knew she could get Esperanza, the mare Carlos had given her. If she could make it to the main road, perhaps she could find someone to help her, or at least get to the nearest town. But before she reached the horses, she heard a terrible scream coming from Sophia's house. It was a sound of pain and fear that made Greta stop in her tracks. They were hurting Sophia, and it was her fault for asking questions, for involving the young woman in her investigation. For one agonizing moment, Greta considered going back to try to help Sophia. But she knew it would be useless. 3 armed men against 2 unarmed women in an isolated location. The only way to really help Sophia would be to escape and bring real help. She was almost at the stables when she heard Carlos shouting her name. "Greta, I know you're there. You can come out now and talk like adults, or I can send my friends to find you. And they're not as nice as I am." The threat was clear. Greta quickened her pace and reached the stable where Esperanza was. The mare recognized her immediately and approached her, as if sensing the urgency of the situation. Greta quickly put on a simple saddle, a process she had practiced hundreds of times in recent months. "If you run away, Greta, little Sophia will pay the price," Carlos shouted from somewhere closer now. "She already told me everything you talked about Ingrid, about the other farms. Do you really think you can blackmail me?" Greta mounted Esperanza and left the stable just as she saw flashlights approaching. She spurred the mare toward the open fields, knowing that her only advantage was her familiarity with the terrain after months of living there. "There she is, on the brown mare," she heard someone shout behind her. The sound of car engines roaring to life made her look back. Carlos and his men were trying to follow her by car, but in the open, uneven fields, Esperanza had a significant advantage. The mare knew every hole, every stream, every obstacle on the property. For the next hour, it was a desperate chase across the Argentine pampas. Greta rode as she had never ridden before, using everything Carlos had taught her about moving across the countryside to keep her pursuers at bay. The cars could pick up speed on the flat parts, but they were forced to slow down or make turns on the more difficult terrain. As the sun began to rise, Greta finally spotted the main road in the distance, but between her and salvation lay one last obstacle, a river she would have to cross. Esperanza hesitated at the bank, sensing the strong current of the water. "Come on, girl," Greta whispered, stroking the mare's neck. "It's our only chance." Esperanza entered the water, fighting against the current. For a few terrifying moments, Greta thought they would both be swept away, but the mare was strong and determined. They made it to the other side, wet and exhausted, but alive. Across the river, Greta could see Carlos and his men standing on the opposite bank. They had lost the chase, the cars couldn't cross the water, and it would take several hours to find a bridge. But Carlos shouted one last threat across the water. "You can run, Greta, but you can't hide. I have your documents, your money, everything, and I have friends in Buenos Aires too. You'll never make it out of Argentina." 2 hours later, Greta arrived at the police station in the nearest town, riding Esperanza and still wet from the river crossing. Her appearance, a clearly panicked German woman riding a wet mare into a rural police station, caused immediate commotion. "Please, I need to speak to someone from the German consulate in Buenos Aires," she said in halting Spanish to the officer on duty. "My name is Greta Schneider. I am a German citizen, and there are women being held against their will on farms in this area." The officer, initially skeptical, completely changed his attitude when Greta showed him the photos of the documents she had taken. 2 hours later, she was speaking via video conference with the German consul, while a police operation was being mounted to rescue Sofia and investigate the other farms mentioned in Carlos's documents. "Miss Schneider," said the consul, "your courage may have saved several lives. We will make sure you get home safely and that Mr. Mendoza faces justice for his crimes." The police operation found Sofia injured but alive, along with enough evidence to arrest Carlos and dismantle his human trafficking network. The other 3 farms were simultaneously raided, resulting in the rescue of 6 women who were being held in slave-like conditions. 3 weeks later, Greta was back in Dusseldorf, penniless but alive. She had lost her savings, but she had gained something more valuable: the satisfaction of knowing that she had turned her own victimization into justice for other women. Carlos Mendoza was sentenced to 25 years in prison for human trafficking, money laundering, and murder. Ingrid's body was found exactly where Sofia had indicated. His network was completely dismantled, and the women he had kept as slaves were freed and given assistance to rebuild their lives. And on a small farm in the Argentine pampas, a brown mare named Esperanza grazes freely, cared for by an NGO that works with victims of human trafficking, a living monument to the courage of a German woman who refused to be just another silent victim.